humans are starting to fight back against these extinction rates. And one way we're doing that is recognizing what species are at risk globally. And I want to specifically talk about how we're recognizing which species are at risk in Canada, like this ash tree that is recently being threatened by an exotic species, the emerald ash borer, which has no predators and is really having a decimating effect on some of the ash populations. Here are some acronyms for you to learn. SARA, the Species at Risk Act, is the federal law in Canada that protects species at risk. So once we have named a species as at risk, threatened, endangered, those species then are federally protected by the Species at Risk Act. Globally, species are recorded as at risk or not by the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature. The IUCN keeps track of what species are struggling. They have records of population, and they have a red list of species that are extremely at risk. This is one of the first global efforts to help species at risk. It was started in 1948, and over 1,000 organizations are part of this union. So it started off not as countries, but as companies working together. And now countries also are part of this. So IUCN is just a group of people that label organisms. CITES, the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species, is the law that enforces the recommendations of the IUCN. CITES is an agreement that countries sign saying that if a species is labeled to be endangered or at risk, that that country will not trade in products made from that species. So this is the rule that stops people from selling ivory. This is the law that stops people from selling tortoiseshell products or medicines made from endangered species. But countries have to agree to be a part of this and have to agree to enforce it. Then COSWIC, the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, this is our version of the IUCN. So this is created through SARA. SARA is the federal law, but COSWIC is the committee that makes recommendations to SARA. COSWIC has no legal power. They just monitor species and label them as at risk. And then if they label them as at risk, then SARA, that federal law, protects those species. COSWIC is across Canada. We actually have an Ontario version called COSERO. And it's these labels that we use in Canada. The COSWIC labels, starting with the most severe, are extinct. When a species is extinct, it is no longer found anywhere. And COSWIC will sometimes differentiate between globally extinct and locally extinct. Extirpated are species that are no longer found in Canada. They're not extinct globally, they're only extinct in Canada. So we use the term extirpated. Endangered are species that are facing imminent extirpation. So these are species that we are worried that if present trends continue, they will become extinct or extirpated very soon. Threatened are the species that we're worried are on the trend to become endangered. This is different than other countries. The IUCN list and the American lists use the word vulnerable instead of threatened. But it means the same thing. Species that we're worried are on the path to becoming endangered. We then have an extra category for species that have characteristics that make them vulnerable. So I have a whole other slideshow on what makes species vulnerable. We call these species special concern. So if we have species that we think currently their populations are okay, but we're worried because they have these characteristics that other threatened and endangered species have, we put them on special concern. You'll also see on the COSWIC listing species that are not at risk. So we've studied them and their populations are doing fine. We have species that are data deficient. No one's done the research to know if they should be on the COSWIC list and possibly currently doing that research. We use the term uplisted and downlisted when species are moved between categories. In class, I would present this slide with the swift fox, and I would ask you to go research. Go onto the COSWIC website, find the swift fox, and tell me, what are they? Are they extinct, extirpated, endangered, threatened, special concern, or not at risk? If you're feeling up to it, you can pause this video and go and look it up now, because I'm going to tell you the answer in a second. The swift fox is an interesting one because while it is currently threatened, it has had a wild ride this past 100 years. It was completely extirpated from Canada in the 30s. And then foxes were reintroduced into a park in Saskatchewan and Alberta. And because they were back in Canada, they were moved to endangered. But that population did not do very well, and they had to be reintroduced a few times before we got a successful population breeding in Canada. And they're doing so well of late that they've been downlisted to threatened, which is fantastic. This is a prairie species, and we'll see a trend here with prairie species. Next up is the least bittern. So go to the COSWIC website, look up what is the least bittern labeled as currently. They are currently threatened. This is a species that used to be special concern because it is a wetland species and their population has been dwindling and they've been changed from special concern to threatened. Wetlands in Ontario and Quebec have frequently been at risk. In Southern Ontario, we've actually created rules for protecting wetlands because they are becoming so rare. The greater prairie chicken, we've got another prairie species, you should go look up. How's it doing? The greater prairie chicken is currently extirpated from Canada. We used to have a lot of these in the prairies. But the wild prairies no longer exist. Majority of the prairie has been turned into farmland. And the greater prairie chicken relied upon large swaths of tall grass prairies. And that is the most threatened of the type of prairie. There are still small populations in the United States, but they're not doing well. It's difficult to reintroduce them back into Canada because the population is under threat in the States, and there really is no habitat to reintroduce them into. We've destroyed most of it, if not all of it. Next up, North American beaver, not the mountain beaver, Castor canadensis. See if you can find it on the COSWIC website. The North American beaver is a great species to look at. It's currently not at risk. It has a thriving population. I usually ask the class, how many of you have actually seen a beaver? They're quite common, to the point where we consider them pests. But there was one point in the history of Canada where they were trapped for fur and their populations were declining. There's been a wild ride for the beaver populations in North America. Okay, passenger pigeon. This one is a drawing and not a photograph, which might give you a clue. The passenger pigeon is extinct and has been extinct for a long time. We hunted them to extinction years ago, despite the fact that they were one of the largest populations of birds ever. But like many things, we underestimated our ability to overhunt a species and their ability to repopulate. The Great Plains toad. This is another prairie species. Go look it up. Frequently these species, when you're looking them up, you're not Googling it under Great Plains toad. It'll be like toad, comma, Great Plains. Or Google the scientific name, Buglocognatus. The Great Plains toad is currently special concern. Its populations are doing okay, but it is a prairie species, and the prairies are a super threatened habitat. And in recent years, the population has been declining somewhat. So it was put on special concern so that it would be protected and watched and monitored for future population decline. My favorite question is why? Why do we do this? Why are we identifying which species are at risk? Why are we monitoring? Why are we trying to protect them? I talked about in another PowerPoint that extinction happens, that it's a normal part of life. So why are we worried about these species going extinct? And again, this would be a time to have a class discussion, but think about it and I'll tell you the answers. This is not all of the reasons. The reasons for identifying species at risk and protecting them are vast. I don't have time to discuss all of them, but some of the reasons are here. Biodiversity equaling ecosystem health is one of the biggest. I like to think of this as a Jenga tower. If we have a Jenga tower of species and you pull one out, that's going to affect some species, but the tower might teeter a little, but it still stays standing. You take out another species and it might affect a few species, the tower wobbles, but it's still standing. We don't know which species is the one that is going to cause the tower to topple until it's gone. And ecologists don't want that tower to topple. We don't want humans to be the species that goes extinct next. And we don't know which species at risk is the one that's going to start that toppling. So the loss of one species has effects on other species, and we worry about that. We also worry about the loss of potential medicines. Species are going extinct that we don't even know exist. So identifying them gives us an idea of at what rate we're losing these species, what knowledge we're losing that we don't even know that we have. We like to identify species at risk and label them and know that if we're monitoring this indicator species and its population is declining, that it's not the only one, that there's probably other things happening. So that indicator species tells us a warning signal for the rest of that ecosystem. All of this can be applied to our agricultural species. Things that are causing wild species to be at trouble can also cause our agricultural species. We want the food that we eat to still be around. If we can learn what keeps an ecosystem happy, we can apply that to our agricultural systems and try to keep them happy as well. And lastly, I don't want to forget that we're also keeping an eye on these species because we like them. There's a reason the panda bear is the World Wildlife Foundation logo and not an endangered clam. We like pandas. People will pay money to go see pandas. So there are ecosystems that are beautiful, that are at risk, and protecting them can be an economically viable thing for communities. Endangered species can be a tourist attraction, as well as places that we just like to be. We want to protect our local forest because we like walking in it, including our personal and economical uses of those species at risk is important to remember, as well as the ecological and medicinal and agricultural reasons. There are many more, but let's stop there.